So the Fox 2.5 Factory Series front coilover reservoir shocks are currently some of the best shocks available if you own an 09 to 18 four-wheel drive equipped F-150, rolling on a factory ride height up to a 2-inch lift. And I say that for a couple of reasons. Now for starters, we are working with a 2.5-inch body and reservoir, and that sounds like pretty standard fare, and that's where the standard stuff ends. If you take a quick look at the shock, you'll see that we're working with some pretty cool coatings and platings. Specifically, we got some nice zinc coatings, we got a nice chrome plating on the tube itself, and we got some nice anodized finish on all that aluminum everywhere, as opposed to the factory shocks painted finish, but I'll show you guys more on that in a little bit. We're also working with some adjustable eye-box springs. Those spring rates are specifically designed for the lighter F-150, and that spring is adjustable so you can dial things in, even though this is not equipped with the Fox DSC adjustments. Now, besides that, we're also working with a redundant 3-seal setup, so this thing will never leak on you, no matter how hard you put it through its paces. We got a main seal, then we got a wiper seal and a scraper seal, and obviously we got the external reservoir. That increases our fluid capacity, that prevents overheating and cavitation and overall fade as far as damping goes. Now, as far as pricing goes, yes, these guys are obviously on the higher end of the pricing spectrum, but as far as external reservoir shocks go and as far as adjustable shocks go, these guys are actually a little bit less expensive than some of the other comparable options. Specifically, I'm talking about the Icon dynamic shocks with external reservoirs, as well as the same shocks from Fox that include the DSC adjustments on top of the adjustments that this already provides. So you are saving a little bit of money if you spring for these guys over those other options, no pun intended. And on the bottom of that shock, we're also working with an upgraded spherical bearing, which is a huge upgrade over that factory rubber bushing, but I'll get to that in a little bit when we pull that factory strut off of there. I'll show you guys a comparison and dive into that a little bit further. And lastly, of course, we got those preload adjustments for up to that 2-inch lift, so everything will be dialed in nicely no matter what ride height you are working with. Now, as far as the install goes, it's pretty straightforward. It is technically a bolt-on job, but we are working with some primary suspension components, and you're gonna need a decent amount of tools here. So for that reason, I'm gonna give the install a modest 2 out of 3 wrenches on my difficulty meter. Should take you about 2 to 4 hours to get both sides done, and I'm actually going to show you guys the install step by step. So again, if you're looking for arguably the most capable shocks for the front of your F-150 so you can run it hard pretty much on a daily basis off-road, you should be checking out the Fox 2.5 series. And if you want to pull the trigger on these guys, stick around. I'm going to show you guys what tools you need in just a second, and then we'll get started on that install. All right, guys, we're definitely breaking out the toolbox for this one. To start off, you're going to need some safety glasses and a hammer. You're going to need some standard drive ratchets, and you're going to need a 5/16 and a 10mm socket. You're also going to need a bunch of deep sockets, including a 13, a 15, an 18, a 19, a 13/16, a 21, a 22, and potentially a 27mm deep socket. You'll need some wrenches, including a 17, 18, and 13/16 wrench, and it's helpful to have a breaker bar and a pry bar with you. Now, you might need an air hammer for this one. You're definitely going to need a 7/32 drill bit with a cordless drill, and it's always helpful to have an air gun and an impact swivel for some of those bigger things. All right, guys, before we start actually breaking apart our suspension components, we want to take a little bit of weight off of here because we're going to be moving all this stuff around. So we want to remove our caliper, and we're also going to take some slack on this little line here. So to remove that bracket, you'll need a 5/16 socket, and then to remove the caliper, you'll need a 13mm socket. All right, next we're going to loosen our tie rod end here. You're going to need a 13/16 wrench for this guy. And if the stud starts spinning on you, you'll need a 10mm socket for the bottom of it. All right, once you remove that nut, if the stud is stuck inside of the knuckle, you can just give a good tap on here with a hammer and that should free it up. All right, next we're going to tackle our ball joint here. This is an 18mm nut, and if this guy starts spinning on you, you're going to need an 8mm socket for the stud. All right, next we can finally start removing our strut. We have to tackle the 2 nuts securing it to the lower control arm. We'll need an 18mm deep socket for these. All right, next we're going to tackle the top of the strut here. Now, normally these would be hex head nuts on top between 15 and 18mm, but because we have a spacer lift on here, these are actually Allen head bolts, so I'm using a 5/16 Allen key to tackle these. And now, it is a bit of a squeeze in here, whether you're tackling those hex head nuts or Allen head bolts, depending on your setup. So you'll probably have to use hand tools. Might take you a minute, just gotta take your time. All right, now once you've tackled the top of the strut, normally you should be able to get enough movement in there in the lower control arm to pop it out, but since we have that spacer in place, things are still a little bit tight. So we're actually gonna loosen the end link on our sway bar, and for that you're gonna need an 18mm deep socket. All right, so we loosened our sway bar end link, and we're still running into a little bit of a clearance issue with getting the strut out. That's okay. We're actually going to loosen the bolts and nuts on our lower control arms, and you might run into this issue whether or not you have a spacer lift on your truck. But at any rate, we're going to break out the big guns here. For the nut on the end of the bolt on the lower control arm, you'll need a 27mm socket. All right, so we loosened the bolts and nuts on our lower control arm, but unfortunately we are still running into some clearance issues with getting the strut out of there. Now the bolts on the bottom of the strut are actually press fit, so we're gonna use an air hammer to knock those loose. Now if you get to this point, these things are pretty loud. You're gonna wanna have some hearing protection and some eye protection if you get to this point. All right, now when I go to air hammer this, I'm keeping the nut on the end of the bolt here. That way we're not gonna mushroom this out too badly. All right, now that we got that one bolt out, we put a through bolt here with a nut on the end to secure the strut. Now we're gonna tackle the other side. We're gonna loosen this nut, keep it flush with the end of the bolt so that doesn't mushroom. All right, once you've popped the bolt loose, you can take the nut off the end. Should slide out just like so. All right, so we finally got those bolts out of the strut. We should have enough clearance with a little bit of help from our pry bar to get that strut out of there. Go ahead and shove it underneath the tongue where the bolts were, pry up on it, and you should be able to clear the lower control arm. All right, so we finally got our factory strut removed. We got the new Fox 2.5 series sitting next to it. Now you guys can actually see a good comparison between the two, and you can pretty much see how I mentioned earlier, we're definitely going from mild to wild in pretty much every aspect, right? Visually speaking, this just has a painted finish on it. We're going with some really nice chrome, zinc, black anodized finishes on here. These finishes will take some real abuse when you do take your truck off-road, so you don't gotta worry about this thing rusting out on you or looking ugly anytime soon. Now, as far as functionality is concerned, something I like about this shock in terms of actual control off-road, we're getting rid of those soft rubber bushings, right? Those things are great at handling noise, vibration, and harshness, or NVH, but if you get a lot of suspension articulation, it can kind of make that rebound a little unpredictable. That's not the case here. We got spherical bearings on this guy. While that might increase noise, vibration, and harshness just a slight amount, the damping on this thing is awesome, so it should help with that, and it's gonna help with that rebound and predicting how the truck is gonna feel off-road. And then of course, the big star of the show here, we got that external reservoir. That's a 2.5-inch body, as well as the shock itself. And you got our brackets right there. I'm gonna show you guys where those go in just a second. I don't need to talk your ear off anymore. If you guys committed to these, you already know how amazing they are, for lack of better phrasing. So let's go ahead and get this new one bolted up. All right guys, so each of the Fox shocks are actually designed for one side of the truck, left and right side. However, when you go to throw it in, you might notice that the tongues here, where the through bolts are supposed to go through the lower control arm, might be oriented in the wrong direction. So, easy way to fix that, go ahead and grab a vise. You want to be very careful with this. You don't want to scratch these or mar these up too much, especially the holes where the bolts go through. But secure it in a vise with a cloth right there, then you can actually use the entire shock as leverage and rotate it, and that should rotate these in the correct orientation so we can get those bolts in the lower control arm. All right, so we got the fittings on the end here rotated. We're finally ready to throw it in place. So we're gonna throw it in place, and then we're actually gonna secure the top before we secure the lower control arm. There are 3 nuts on top of here with flat washers, and you'll need a 17mm wrench for these guys. All right, so we got those 3 nuts in place. We're gonna leave those hand tight for now. We're not gonna tighten them down just yet. We want a little bit of play in the shock. That way we can actually get the bolts on the bottom there through that lower control arm. All right, so we got a jack underneath our lower control arm. That way we can kind of close the gap here between the bottom of the shock and the lower control arm. We're gonna get one of these bolts in here, hand tighten it, then we can throw the other one in and get that jack out of the way. All right, now that we have the bottom tightened down, we can tighten down these nuts on top. Again, you'll need that 17mm wrench. All right, so our strut is in place. We tighten down all our hardware. Before we actually secure the reservoir, we want to make sure all of our suspension components are going to play nice together. So we're going to reassemble everything. We're going to get that sway bar end link tightened down. We're going to throw our tie rod end into the knuckle. Then we're going to get our ball joint seated again. All right, if that starts spinning on you like it just did for me, you can grab that socket and put it on the end of the stud there, tighten it in the opposite direction, and that'll tighten that nut to the ball joint. All right, with all our suspension components in place, we're gonna throw our caliper back on. And again, you'll need a 13mm socket to get the bolts back on. All right, we're also going to re-secure this little plastic bracket here as well, and you'll need a 5/16 socket for the bolt. All right, if you did end up having to loosen your lower control arm nuts and bolts, go ahead and make sure you tighten those again. And again, you'll need a 27mm socket for the nut. All right, now that everything's back together, we're finally ready to mount our reservoir. Now the bracket for the reservoir is gonna go in this location right here. The instructions mention that there's some sort of body mount right here with a factory bolt, and that bolt would normally secure this hole on the bracket, but since that's not there, we're actually gonna get a little creative here. We're actually gonna throw a speed clip in place, and we're gonna use an M10 bolt to secure the one side. Then once we get the bracket lined up, I'll show you guys how to drill that other hole for the other one. All right, now we're gonna drill our pilot hole for our self-tapping screws. You're gonna need a 7/32 drill bit for this one. All right, now that our hole is drilled and cleaned up, we can install that self-tapping screw. You can use a 10mm socket to get it. All right, now that our bracket is in place, we can throw our reservoir up there. Go ahead and throw one of your hose clamps on the end right here and line it up with this little opening in the bracket itself. You're not going to have the clamps go through these, rather you're going to have them go behind them. Once you tighten them down, the little notch in the bracket will keep them in place. And once you got everything situated, you can tighten down these clamps using an 8mm socket. So once you got the reservoir in place, if you need to make any adjustments to your preload, go ahead and open up the install guide that came in the kit itself. It'll actually tell you exactly what tools you need. You will probably need a spring compressor, and it'll give you the steps on what you need to do to tackle that main spring retainer to make those preload adjustments. But that actually wraps up the install itself. Now that also wraps up my review of the Fox 2.5 Factory Series front coilover reservoir shocks for up to a 2-inch lift, fitting your 09 to 18 four-wheel drive equipped F-150. I'm Travis, thanks for watching, and for all things F-150, keep it right here at AmericanTrucks.com.